streaming anyway.
Energy ammo here. Taking him out with a decoy. I'm down. Making contact. And then there were two. Keep up with me, compadre. Jump pad out. Fire. Sergeant. Contact.
I don't know what's happened. I'm playing really badly. I'm being idiots, shooting around. Just shooting. Just trying to attract people. But they weren't really ready for people coming because they decided they're gonna be at the lowest point on the map. So real idiots that play this game, I have to admit. Alright, the stream should be up.
You also met with the, you know,
You and me, friend.
English Queen, man.
Who's this?
Tito.
Which one? Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, yeah, man.
If they're going
Sophia
to
Loren, Kennedy, all of these guys, you know. Because
Blimey.
he was communist, but he was not, you know, with Stalin. So
I know where we want to be.
communist
Follow me.
slash capitalist.
Yeah, the whole Yugoslav thing is crazy, man. It's just like, you know, as soon as the Soviet Union went down, everyone went their own separate ways. And it became problematic, to say the least.
This is your champion.
Badass he was.
Let's make a choice. Land here.
Have you heard from Virus at all?
Boom.
Virus.
No.
The Kosovo. Was it Montenegro guy?
No, he's yeah, Kotor, Montenegro.
Yeah.
Nobody heard from him in years. Islam's.
He's more Lem's buddy, really.
Yeah.
Let's explore this way.
I haven't seen him for years either. Nice guy, to be fair, but didn't speak much.
Round one. Beginning ring countdown. Attention. First blood.
First blood. The battle begins.
I'm a literal Hoover when it comes to when it comes to just picking up everything.
New kill leader appointed.
Watch out for the new kill leader, friend.
Gotta hop up here. Choke.
Yep. AMD Ryzen is a real problem.
Hemlock here.
Is it real what?
They say it's a real problem for Intel, these new AMD CPUs, man.
Of course they are. They're cheaper, faster, and cooler.
Consumes less, yeah, and consumes less power.
Yeah.
Actually, people care about that nowadays.
A lot. Anyone who's a gamer ain't gonna give it monkeys about power.
Ah, yeah, you
Let's
think
explore
that.
this way.
Well,
Nice,
mo-
nice. It's not precisely, but you rather have something that uses 65 watts than 120.
yeah, well, yeah.
Gotta hop up here. Might be something good this
Linus
way.
says I need
The
to buy
ring is in
AMD
close
stuff
proximity. Less than 1 minute.
now. I wonder if they are going to post it.
They're gonna do what?
30 seconds remain.
They
The
are
ring
going
is
to post
nearby.
it like in a second. I'm just refreshing this.
Yeah, it'll be timed release.
Map shows
Oh,
we're
there
spread
is
out
guy
a lot.
already posted. You never get AMD again. 30 minutes.
10 seconds. The ring's close.
He wants to be a douchebag and not buy AMD. It's up to him. You know, lots of people will.
Firing. This way. Let's go.
Warning. Movement in progress.
The ring's moving, friends.
Man, look at this hardware shop. It's like full with CPUs, motherboards. We don't have this in Denmark, man. It's all, everything is online, you know.
Observing that spot.
It's like supermarket. You go with the basket and you put the parts you need into your basket and you go pay. We don't have these physical shops here in Denmark anymore like that.
They spotted me. I'm taking shots.
Yeah. In general
Reloading.
as well, you don't get anything anymore.
Contact. Hostile close. I've been
Let's see.
down.
He's gonna be out soon.
Care package.
Dude, are you just leaving
Incoming
us
care
here,
package. I love
running
you.
No,
off on your
Not
then maybe
really.
play a
But you
simple
haven't
break.
communicated all round, so what do you expect? I was
We
going
actually
some way.
pinged where we were going, and
Well, you pinged while I was doing something else.
so solo in a team game is up.
Shut up. The fact that I'm coming for you is good enough, isn't it?
Frag out. Frag out. Arms are out. Friends, Ben, this is great.
Hey, you jumped, you ran, you shot a thing maybe, but then you met me.
Honestly, there's some idiots who don't communicate all game, and then they start using comms when they get knocked out. Do you know what I mean?
What are the prices in UK thing?
I don't know what for a thing. AMD. AMD.
Let me see if there is a
So I'll tell you what the price is quickly.
overclockers.
I'm on overclockers as well. Yay! AMD CPUs you're looking for.
Wonder if they're out now.
Ryzen 3rd gen. No, nothing yet. They're not being released yet. Although there's in the gen, but it's not there yet. Oh, nothing at the moment.
You click on AMD third,
Yeah,
gen,
nothing.
and it puts out gaming chairs.
Yeah, it doesn't.
What a stupid website, man.
Yeah. I honestly don't like Overclocker's website ever since the redesign. Let's have a look at Aria.
You can buy it here in Denmark, so I don't know why.
It's evening,
Are you
isn't it?
pleased?
Well, just people, they're not doing it basically at the moment. It's not out yet. Well, no. So, well, they're probably not. So these guys probably haven't prepared properly.
Let's fly.
Sunday, but this is the time where people buy and sell shit, you know.
Yeah, okay, here you go. 1899. 189.99 for this one. There you go.
This might be a good place to land.
Yes.
Hold your
Yeah,
breath if you have to
The
breathe.
3700X. 3700X looks nice.
look what it says.
320.
Look, you can pick it up now.
3700X, but it's an upgrade from my one, just IPC upgrade.
Yeah, but it's also I would not ready if I were you.
Taking fire.
Before.
Lay down, please. I'm down. Actually on
Round 1. Ring countdown.
The next ring is not close. Good to know.
379 and motherboard 100 pounds at least. You're talking about 500 for shipping. For new motherboard and CPU. 500 pounds for new motherboard CPU. You had the first gen, okay, maybe.
Here I go.
Yeah, but I'm looking at how many more cores? Looking at 4 more cores.
What is your, it's your CPU now?
It's the 2700X.
Yeah, but what core?
I can't remember. But I want more, wherever it is.
Click right and look at your...
I'm playing games.
Okay, it's there out. Oh, jeez.
Defending this location.
What's up? Oh, the reviews.
Yeah, German website, and they're testing Ryzen 9 390X.
Oh, hello. Yes. Alright, Games Nexus. Where? Let's have a look.
He doesn't have nothing yet. It's like 4 minutes ago.
No,
and
no, no. He's got a review. He says he's got a review. Well, I just saw a review of the 3600. He said.
Send me the link.
Alright, I'm gonna watch this. I'm stopping playing.
Yeah, let's watch. When is this?
Today, just now. Only 175 people viewed it. Alright. Tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Go for it,
3,
Cat.
2, 1, go.
Alongside the R9 3900X and R7 3700X that
Shit
we're also
amazing, it's
reviewing,
Dutchy joined
AMD
your
launched its
channel.
R5 3600
Oh,
today
we
to the
stopped
public.
playing, we were looking
We
at
got a
review.
production sample of one of the R5 3600 CPUs through a third party, and
They're gonna
after
jump up,
seeing its
sorry.
performance, we wanted to
Don't
focus
confuse
first
people.
on this
Jump
one
down,
for
jump
our
down, there's
initial
Shit
Ryzen
amazing, it's
3000
Dutchy
review.
left your
This
channel.
CPU is supposed to be a
I'm gonna move
$200
us
part.
into
Yeah,
We've been recommending AMD's R5 CPUs since the first generation.
Crow left your
as
channel.
Intel's i5 CPUs have seen struggles lately in frame time consistency and are often close enough to AMD
Cat
that the
playing with the
versatility,
CPU.
frame time consistency, and
I love it.
close enough gaming performance have warranted R5 purchases. Today we're revisiting with the R5 3600 6-core 12-thread
Why is he
CPU
hiding the serial
to look
number?
at gaming, production workloads like Premiere, Blender, and V-Ray, and more, power consumption, and overclocking. Before that, this video is brought to you by Gigabyte's X570 Aorus Master motherboard, built with a true 14-phase
Why is
VRM
that
and for
just
high-end
promoting other
Ryzen
shit,
3000 series builds.
He always
The
does
Gigabyte
that.
X570 Master uses a properly finned heatsink for VRM cooling,
Look at this bad boy.
accompanied by RGB LEDs in the I/O cover to mix looks and performance. Gigabyte also includes BIOS flash features to update the motherboard BIOS without a CPU or RAM. The overbuilt VRM is the major feature on this board, though, and Gigabyte has a brand new BIOS for overclocking the new Ryzen 3000 series
Looks
CPUs.
nice.
Learn more at the link in the description
Yeah,
below.
I'll go
A
Gigabyte
couple
now.
of quick notes on this. This CPU was not sent out by AMD, and so
That's
this
why.
is a production sample, but it's from a third party, and that means that you probably won't see too many of these reviews just yet, but they are going to be sold. So these will be $200 for the R5 3600. There's an X SKU as
So
well.
that's why he's
the
hiding
X
it. He
SKU
doesn't
has
want- he doesn't
a
want to let-
200
he
megahertz
doesn't want to let
higher
who's
advertised
giving
boost
it to him,
frequency,
though.
whereas this one's at 3200. That would be at 3400 megahertz. So those are the main differences. There's a price difference as well. But just like previous generations where you can buy the non-X SKU and then overclock it to match the X SKU, that's basically the only difference. It's the frequency, and everything else is the same between the X SKU 3600 and
Why
the
would
non-X
you buy
SKU.
it?
So you could buy this one and overclock it, or because we've already overclocked it in our charts, you can look at that data and then extrapolate where the X would land if you do prefer that one. Our 3900X and 3700X overclocked with much better voltages, although the same frequency, than our 3600. And some of that is potentially because of the higher end CPUs requiring higher quality silicon. So that's part of it, probably. We'll note also that the CPUs AMD sent had thermal paste left on them, so something to take note of as well. But our 3600, although it overclocked reasonably, it did require a lot more voltage.
That's
than our
why
3900X.
you buy
We'll
X.
talk about that
It
more
overclocks
in the
better.
3900X review,
Yeah.
which is coming up after this one and after our 5700XT review. So those are the main notes. Other than that, all Windows updates up to 1903 have been applied for our new CPU test bench.
Cool.
And BIOS mitigations have been applied for Intel CPUs. We're on the latest
See,
BIOS for
this
just
is-
about
this is-
everything.
this is-
unless
this is
there's
why I like this
a
guy.
reason not to. For example, the AMD BIOSes for Ryzen 3000, there are a couple that are questionable right now. So for BIOS, we're using FC5 for the Gigabyte X570 Master. That's the motherboard we used for all of our new Ryzen testing that you'll be seeing this week. And we do have other boards as well, but we're starting with that one. The F clock is another thing I wanted to mention. So the Infinity Fabric clock is going to be a big part of overclocking for this generation of Ryzen from what we understand. We've done some F-clock overclocking, and it won't be included in this review because without also overclocking the memory, it doesn't really do a whole lot, and at least versus auto. So we're going to be visiting F-clock in a separate piece, and we're also doing some XOC liquid nitrogen overclocking, hopefully this week with Ryzen
Yeah, big
and the
tank of
X570
liquid
CPU. So we'll have a
nitrogen.
lot of depth on that coming up as we tinker with it with liquid nitrogen. Timings for this updated bench have been very heavily controlled. So we've improved our test bench and our testing methodology significantly for this round of testing. We are now manually controlling more or less every single timing in BIOS. Before we did the important ones, but now we've controlled all of them. So RFC, for example, can have a pretty big impact, and it's to the extent that it tightens the error margins. So it's an extra plus or minus 1% closer every time we do the runs, and now sometimes it's 0.1 FPS different run to run, which is fantastic. Let's get straight into it. We like to illustrate CPU behavior on new architecture launches. Part of this is to look for boost duration limitations or power fluctuations, something we'll cover next. The first chart shows frequency over time with a Blender workload, which is a 3D rendering application hitting all cores nearly equally. The average all-core frequency ends up at about 4104 megahertz. The CPU was under a 280mm CLC with 22-degree ambient for this test, so boost behavior was not thermally affected. The CPU has an advertised boost clock of 4200 megahertz, which will apply for workloads that don't fully load the cores at 100%. There's minimal fluctuation with this frequency plot, and it does not appear that any boost duration limits come into play. Boost duration limits are typically close to the 100-second mark, for example. For a better view of this, we'll plot each core clock individually and with the y-axis constrained to just 4050 to 4200 megahertz. The point of this is to magnify the data. As observed here, pre-testing starts with cores bouncing off of the 4200 megahertz limited core turbo while still in idle. Once the work begins, the cores take turns bursting up to 4125 megahertz and falling back to 4100, with rare dips down to 4080. We'll keep drawing other cores as we go here. There doesn't seem to be a preference for which core boosts up to 4125. They all do it at some point. A pattern emerges where cores 0 and 1 will pass the ball back and forth, and then on to cores 4 and 5, and 2 and 3 seem to do similar. At the end of the day, they all take turns boosting. We'll use Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p to give a gaming look at frequency behavior. We'll also skip straight to the zoomed in chart for a better highlight of the boosting. In this chart, we stay closer to an average of 4175 megahertz boost when under heavier loads. With the lighter threaded scenes rendered, we see single core boosts up to 4200 megahertz, the maximum stock boost, before falling back to 4150 to 4175. As for the core number 5 dip below the chart range, that spike falls to about 3300 megahertz. We use two of Total Warhammer 2's baked-in benchmarks, starting with Battle, designed to test performance on the RTS map. We also test with the campaign for a look at turn-based vantage points. Strategy games are a good place to demonstrate performance for CPUs, as AI processing is often CPU intensive. The higher-end Intel CPUs at 1080p approach a GPU bottleneck with a maximum average FPS of 174 for the 5.1 GHz 9900K. AMD's R5 2600 and R5 1600 came nowhere close to this limit previously, with the overclocked 4.2 GHz 2600 maxing out at 145 FPS average. The R5 3600 makes a big step towards closing that gap with a stock average of 159 FPS, a 27.3% improvement over the stock 1600, and a 10% improvement over the overclocked 2600's 4.2 GHz score. Overclocking the 3600 yielded a minor 3 FPS improvement to 162 FPS average, but leaving the frequency stock and disabling SMT bumps the 3600 score up to equal the stock 9600K, placing at 166 FPS average. We've observed in the past that Total Warhammer 2 and some other games can react negatively to hyperthreading or SMT, so this is one way of leveling that out with the 6-core, 6-thread 9600K. We first broke this information in the first generation Ryzen reviews, and it seems that this persists here. We wouldn't recommend actually disabling SMT, as the usefulness is a wash between games, some like it, some don't, and ultimately it's better to have the extra threads. That is half the reason you're buying the processor anyway. This is more of an exercise to demonstrate behavior in Zen 2 versus the original. As for the 9600K, the stock performance leads the stock 3600 by 4.4%. They're close enough that other applications may matter more than this delta. We'll look at production workloads later. The Total War 1440p battle benchmark is a GPU bottleneck, so we can't see any CPU differences until we get to the bottom of the chart. We'll move on from this one quickly and leave discussion for it in the article below if you want to read a bit more. The second Total War benchmark uses the campaign map as seen in the grand strategy portion of the game. It's much more CPU dependent than the battle benchmark, so we'll start with 1080p. At 1080p, the R5 3600 stock 155 FPS average shows a 7% improvement over the 2600 overclocked to 4.2 GHz, and a 33% improvement over the stock 1600. This beats the full range of older 6-core Ultra AMD parts, overclocked or not. Overclocking the 3600 itself was ineffectual in this test, as it was with the Total War Battle benchmark. But again, disabling SMT offered a boost to performance that made the 3600's performance around the stock 9600Ks, both at 161 to 165 FPS average. That's stock-to-stock frequency. The 9600K has much more overclocking headroom, with a 13% FPS improvement from stock to 5.2 GHz in this test, ending at an impressive 183 FPS average. The 1440p results aren't as GPU bottlenecked like they were in the battle benchmark, but that also means that much of the chart lines up with the 1080p results. The 3600 with SMT disabled lost some of its edge here, with the 3600 overclocked outperforming it slightly, and the stock 9600K just beyond that. So 1440p sometimes will matter for the CPU choice, and sometimes it won't. Like with the battle benchmark, where we saw they all more or less equaled. If you have 1440p there with any of the top end or even mid-range CPUs, you're going to be limited by the GPU choice. F1 2018 is up next, a DirectX 11 standard implementation of the game on the Ego engine. F1 2018 runs at higher frame rates than any human could require in our 1080p testing, but it still shows good scaling between CPUs. The stock 3600's 267 FPS average is again well ahead of the previous best score for the 6-core 12-thread AMD parts, surpassing the overclocked 2600's 235 FPS average by 14%, and the old stock AMD R5
looks like a
1600 by
14%
34%.
increase,
Overclocking the
effectively,
3600 again had
40 to
very little
20%
effect. AMD's done a good enough job at boosting per-core frequency that it's difficult to improve the performance with an all-core overclock, at least in lightly threaded applications like games. F1 is another title where disabling SMT raises performance, although not quite to the level of the
Why didn't you
9600K
use
this
F1
time. We
2019?
climbed to 273
I
FPS
think they
average with
just,
SMT
I don't
off
know
and
why they're
stock
using it.
clocks. It's possible that disabling hyperthreading would give a slight boost to many of the CPUs on our charts, but it's rarely worth
gives a
going into
crap if
BIOS
it's
and
280
cutting the
or
CPU's thread
270?
count in
Yeah,
half
exactly.
for a minor performance increase in some video
You're not
work
gonna
and
see
some
it.
gaming workloads. The only reason we're treating the CPUs differently is because it's a new architecture, and we want to see if SMT overhead has changed in the past 2 years. Here's a quick frame time chart with F1 2018 at 1080p. Remember that lower is better, but more consistent is better than just being lower. Overall, the R5 3600 remains close to 4.3 to
Look at
5.0
the
millisecond frame-to-frame intervals, and typically we don't
Not
notice
much
stutters unless there's an excursion
movement.
equal to
That's
or
good.
greater than 8 to 12 milliseconds frame to frame, something that
Fluctuates less
only
than
happens
Intel.
once in this benchmark for both tests, and it happens on both the 9600K and the 3600 in the same spot in the same
Same.
test. Overall, these two processors have similar frame time pacing and consistency with at least this game, with the 9600K faster by 0.3 milliseconds on average, frame to frame. 1440p F1 is next. The CPUs at 240 FPS average and above are almost entirely GPU limited, but all of our 3600 results fall just short of that range. The narrower range of results means that all three, stock, overclocked, and SMT disabled for the 3600, averaged almost exactly the same. The 9600K still won out by 4.5% stock versus stock, technically speaking, although the value of the 3600 is a tough match for it, particularly in later tests and with the lower price. The top end of the results hit the GPU limit, so note that all differences are within error margins. That's why the 9900K OC isn't at the top. It's because they're bouncing off the limit, so any delta here is just run-to-run variance. We do multiple passes of the new Gathering Storm AI benchmark for Civilization 6, each of which
is a
takes
game
an
you should
average
play, man.
completion time for 5 turns and then averages those numbers together. It's the only game test we do that isn't measured by frame times, and the results are extremely consistent. We took a look at turn time instead, as this is entirely CPU dependent and heavily impacts how enjoyable the experience is. Unfortunately, despite being an AI benchmark, it shows a strong preference for frequency over thread count, as can be seen by the R5 1600 at 3.2 GHz base, outperforming the R7 1700 at 3 GHz base. The 9600K stock took 34 seconds to complete each turn, reducing average turn time by 5% versus the 3600 stock. And the overclock to 9600K is far
It's just
beyond the
poorly
overclock
threaded, that's
3600 in performance
that's
at
what it
30.3 seconds versus
It's not
35.3.
using
Multiplied
extra
across all
threads,
5 AI
you know.
turns, that
Man,
means
I
it would
would
take
buy
an extra
this
25
without
seconds
blinking,
per
are you
turn for
crazy?
the human player to have input again,
Not even a
and that'd be
contest.
more exaggerated as the game grows complicated. Assassin's Creed Origins has revealed itself to be one of the most balanced titles we test in terms of benefiting from frequency and
look
core
at
count at the
frequency
same
here.
time. Disabling SMT had an appropriately negative result for once, so it's the stock 6-core 12-thread 3600 result
Look at
that
that.
slightly edges out the 9600K
50.
by 1.1 FPS average,
Pretty
more or
good.
less within error
It's-
margins
it's
at
quite
that point,
like- it's
so
about
they are
10-15%
functionally
increase
tied.
from WoW.
Interestingly, the overclocked
Yeah.
results for the two
it's
CPUs
got
are fairly close as well.
2 less
The
cores.
12 threads of the 4.3 GHz 3600 bring it
Okay.
closer to the
No,
5.1
this-
GHz
this
9600K
8-core
than we've seen in the previous
16.
test,
No, it's a
with
6
only a
core,
7.4% advantage for the Intel
If
chip.
you went for that
The
8-core
3600 is
16,
also
then it
the
would be
first of
like
AMD's X600
even more.
series CPUs to break 60 FPS in the 0.1% lows,
I think.
which it does even at stock frequency, all within error margins of each other. The 3600 are pushed together closer by the GPU constraints for this one.
You
The
don't need it,
9600K OC still has an
I want it.
advantage, but again, everything
I know
is
you want it.
clumped together a bit more.
It's
GTA
like you
5
might
is
not need
next.
it,
The
but I
oldest
want it.
game on our bench still has some life left in it, thanks to some settings tweaks to further load on the CPU, and it's also still one of the most played games on Steam. It's another title where disabling SMT allowed for a performance increase of a few FPS, but not past the stock 9600K this time. Frequency is important in this title, and the lack of major improvement with the 3600 overclock all-core settings indicates how close the stock boost frequencies already are to the maximum achievable all-core overclock. We'll be interested to see whether the 3600X can justify its $50 higher price with what seems like very little room for improvement. AMD's generational improvements are as strong as ever here, with a 20.7% uplift over the stock 2600 and a 37.4% improvement over the stock 1600. Pretty good.
It's about
Scaling
50%
at
faster than
1440p
my
between
CPU,
1080p and
which is
1440p is
amazing.
almost perfect for
20,
GTA
yeah.
5, with only the nearly tied overclock 2600X
Because if you think about
and
it-
stock
You need
7600K
the other
trading
CPU
blazes.
man review, not this
FPS
one.
numbers
man.
themselves
but
are also
this
barely
is the
changed,
one that's going to be
meaning
sold
we're a
most
healthy
probably,
distance from
because
a
it's
GPU bottleneck
£189.
or the observed FPS
Today.
cap of about 187.5 FPS.
This one will
for
be sold more than any
engine.
other
You would have to go to a higher
CPU.
resolution or even higher settings to limit the GPU
But it's a good
down
comparison.
to a point where the CPU is bottlenecked. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another one of the minority games where leaving SMT enabled gives us a better result. The stock 3600
Yeah,
showed an 18%
impressively
improvement over the
close
average FPS
to
of
a
the stock
5.2
2600,
clocked
but with barely any
CPU,
further
man.
improvement from overclocking. The generational improvements are big, but it's the same story as it has been. Manufacturers squeeze performance out of parts more efficiently these days, so stock performance goes up, and overclocking
He
headroom
talks too
can
much
go
and
down
he's
as a
getting too
result.
much detail.
The
That's why I don't
9600K
like
is
him,
one
to be
part
honest.
that still has some room left.
Yeah.
And
I
the
just
5.1
tend to
gigahertz
lower
OC
him a bit
13%
and
ahead
just
of
look at the
overclocked
graphs.
3600. Due to popular demand, we've switched to DirectX 12 for our Hitman 2 testing. DX12 support was patched into the game
have
relatively
better
recently,
review.
and any previously published benchmarks from us in the
He's very
CPU side, we're done
detailed.
using
He's more
DX11. We use
detailed.
both 11 and 12 for GPU reviews. Note that DX11 has better frame time pacing and performance than DX12, but so many people seem to prefer the different graphics API that we decided to just move to it for CPU testing, even though the frame time performance is technically worse. Hitman 2 showed a reassuringly strong preference for SMT on rather than off, with a 7.9%
I'll stop watching
improvement from
this.
the extra threads, slightly better than even the 6-core 6-thread stock
But he's
9600K. Our
well,
testing with the 8-core 16-thread
He's basically just
9900K
giving
showed
a
much.
rundown
The
of what was-
1440p results by a production workload. The GNU compiler benchmark is basically the CPU completes our V-Ray result.
So
We can get
he's
into the
doing-
production
he's
work
rendering the thing now, logo.
6-core 6-thread 100 out of the 48 GCC out of a smaller
He's
than usual
compiled.
margin. 3600 stock, just barely better than the 9600K stock. Production workloads next, including Adobe Photoshop, Premiere, Blender, V-Ray,
he's doing
GCC,
Blender now.
GNU compiler collection, and some additional testing. So our GNU compiler collection benchmark is basically a cache benchmark, something that's illustrated clearly by this chart. This demonstrates how quickly the CPU completes our code compile in the benchmarking. It is not,
Do me a favor,
however,
man. Let's watch this
faster
one
and
other one. It's better, man. I'm telling you.
Decompress
Buddy.
points to 10 does show
Go, let's
a
have a look.
processor with compared to production work. Efficiency loss, power for that TDP.
You can see he's actually relaxing.
Problem with the
Jesus is
software.
fucking heavy.
Yeah, Jesus is. Jesus gives you all the information you want. This guy.
Hardware unbox. He's
Generation
good.
Tahara
when
unbox.
you're ready.
Tell me when you're ready.
Okay, ready. 3, 2, 1, go. Look how relaxing this guy is. You know, his way is talking slower and everything.
Welcome back
This
to
guy
Hammer
just blah,
Unboxed.
blah, 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 blah.
Finally, it is time to review AMD's new third
And
generation
he's reviewing
Ryzen
39X
processors.
and
And on hand, we
37X,
have the
which are
Ryzen 9 3900X and the Ryzen 7 3700X.
Yes.
Unfortunately, these are the only two CPUs AMD
fine.
has sent out to reviewers. So the
Yeah, it's
Ryzen
fine.
5 processors and the 3800X, well, yeah, who knows how they perform. We'll know shortly. AMD
shortly,
will be
because it's gonna be
sampling
between
them
the two he's
at a
got.
later
What
date,
an
but we've
imbecile.
just gone out
But
and
look,
purchased
look at
them.
no,
So anyway,
he's not imbecile, man.
at least we've got these
Look at
two.
the benchmarks and
It's
everything.
certainly
How
a lot better than
everything,
nothing.
you know.
And AMD, in their infinite wisdom, also decided to lift the review embargo for both Zen 2 and Navi reviews at the same time. But we're going to delay our Navi review for a little bit, just so you guys can get the Zen 2 stuff and the videos aren't tripping over each other, because we know the YouTube algorithm doesn't particularly like that. And rather than do one video that summarizes both Zen 2 and Navi, we thought we'd just give you all the juicy details on Zen 2 first. But why AMD didn't choose to dominate the news cycle for a few weeks is beyond me, but maybe that's why I don't get paid the big bucks. Anyway, that's just about enough whinging from me. We have a boatload of information to go over,
Look
and
at that
since I know
MSI, it's
most
called
of you
Meg,
really just want to see the
godlike. I
benchmark
might have
results,
to
so I'm
get
not
that.
going to spend too much time going over
That one looks good.
specs and pricing.
I like it.
But before we get into anything, Today's video sponsor is NordVPN, and right now they're offering Harbour Unboxed viewers 75% off
They're
a
actually
3-year
good,
membership
NordVPN.
when you use the link in the video description.
I use
And that works out to
VPN.
be just $2.99 per month, which in my opinion is a very small price to pay for your internet security, allowing you to browse, download, and shop safely. Hardware Unboxed gets bombarded with advertising opportunities from VPN services, and to date, NordVPN is the only company we've worked with, and that's for good reason. It's the only service we use and trust. I've tried a number of different services and they all came up short for one reason or another, but I can honestly say NordVPN is the
I was
best
listening
I've
to
found,
Jesus for
and
15
having been a
minutes. Bear
customer
with
for
me.
well
No,
over a
this
year
guy's
now,
advert
I
is
highly
long.
recommend you check them out.
Yeah.
NordVPN also
He's doing
offers
it
a
properly.
free 30-day money-back guarantee, so start protecting your internet
you
experience
say?
today
But
with
wait,
75%
it's
off
extra
a 3-year
for-
plan by using code HarbourUnboxed at nordvpn.com/HarbourUnboxed. Link is in the video description.
Love it.
Okay, so just quickly, the Ryzen 9 3900X is a 12-core, 24-thread processor with a massive 64MB L3
want
cache.
it.
It runs at a
Yeah,
base
that's why I
frequency of
want to watch this
3.8
review,
GHz
you know.
with a boost
Yeah, I want
frequency
it.
of 4.6
And the other one is
GHz.
good as man.
It costs
Ryzen
$500
7.
US, and that places it in
want
direct
it.
competition with the Core i9 9900K. Then, as I just said, we also have the Ryzen 7 3700X, which costs $330 US, and AMD suggests it's taking on the more expensive 9900K with this part. Anyway, it has 8 cores, 16 threads with a 32MB L3 cache, and clocks anywhere from 3.6 GHz to 4.4 GHz. Both of these 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs come with the Wraith Prism RGB box cooler, and I'll be using that for the majority of our testing. This does mean Intel will have a slight performance advantage here, but please keep in mind the cost of the cooler will be factored into our value analysis for each processor. That said, I will provide some 3900X and 3700X performance figures
the
using
active
an
cooling,
all-in-one
man,
liquid
on the-
cooler as well.
The motherboard.
The
They
MSI
get fast.
X570 Creation was used for testing the 3900X and 3700X, while the Asus ROG Crosshair 7 Hero was used to test the 1st and 2nd gen Ryzen processors. All have been tested with DDR4 3200 CL14 memory,
You
but
can
there
see
will
how
also
it
be
compares
some
to the
memory
old,
scaling benchmarks
Ryzen, you know.
included in the
Yeah,
video, as AMD recommends using DDR4 3600 CL16 memory for best results, so we will look into that. As for the 8th and 9th gen Intel Core processors, they were benchmarked on the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Ultra using the same DDR4 3200 CL14 memory, but they were cooled using the Corsair Hydro Series H115i RGB Platinum 280mm all-in-one liquid cooler. Please note that the Intel
Mine was the
CPUs are
150.
not TDP restricted, as that's not the typical out-of-the-box experience, so that means we're showing the absolute best case scenario for out-of-the-box performance. Finally, the graphics card of choice was the MSI Gaming X Trio GeForce RTX 2080 Ti.
Surprise.
Okay, I think that
Yeah, it's
covers
fair
pretty
enough.
well
It's
everything.
fastest card.
Let's get into the benchmark results and
So it doesn't
maybe
get the
grab a
benchmark,
drink and some snacks
you know,
before we
yeah,
get
frosty,
started.
Bottleneck, yeah.
Okay, so we're better to start than Cinebench R20's multi-threaded benchmark.
yeah,
And oh
yeah,
boy,
yeah,
does
yeah.
the
Holy
Ryzen
crap,
9
holy shit.
3900X
Shit,
look
man.
quite mighty
piece of
here,
Threadripper.
scoring an incredible 7,086 points, making it 24%
Jeez.
faster than the Threadripper 2920X. And that really is incredible.
ridiculous.
Moreover, it completely decimated the 9900K by a 45% margin. The Ryzen 7 3700X was equally impressive. The new 8-core part matched the
And yours
9900K,
is
and this
down
meant it
below,
was
yeah?
22%
27X.
faster than the 2700X,
Oh,
and
no,
30%
yours
faster
is
than the more
26X.
expensive
What was
9700K. Needless to say, these
Oh,
new
okay.
3rd gen Ryzen parts are already looking like
Look at
kings of
Holy
productivity.
crap.
And this is
Now,
good
just have to
comparison,
say,
you know, in
this
this
one
review.
is a rather big
know,
deal.
27X
Here,
to
the
37X,
3900X
if you know
matched
what I
the
mean.
single core performance of the 9900K, and that meant it was 19% faster
Ooh,
than the
it's quite faster, man.
2700X.
Look at
The
that.
3700X also did very well, hitting
why-
500 points,
this
and
why
that
this
placed
review is
it
better for
roughly
you,
on
man.
par with the
20% faster,
9700K.
Yeah, yeah. This is
So
why this review is
this
better,
a
yeah?
massive
20%
performance
faster than
improvement for
mine.
Ryzen.
Exactly. He talks less
So we
and
have
he
some
shows
memory
you
bound
irrelevant
figures,
stuff.
and this is sustained read-write performance. As I said earlier, all CPUs here are using DDR4 3200 CL14 memory, but interestingly, the 3rd gen processors are a little down on the 1st and 2nd gen.
This is
But there
down
is a good
to-
reason for this,
That's
and I will
control.
cover that a bit later in the
Memory
video when
speed,
we're exploring
Yeah,
IPC
fabric or whatever.
performance. For now, let's move on to check out a few application benchmarks. As you can see, the changes AMD made with the Zen 2 architecture have had a profound impact on WinRAR performance. The 3700X is unbelievably 84% faster than the 2700X, allowing it to comfortably beat the 8700K and almost match the Core i9 7900X. The 3900X also put on quite the show,
9900X is
though
a
it was
£500
only
processor,
15%
right?
faster
Yeah,
than the 3700X, and it
More.
couldn't quite match the
Yes,
9900K.
No.
Still, overall, a remarkable performance uplift here over the second gen
love that.
parts. Moving on to 7-zip, and first up we have the compression test, where traditionally Ryzen hasn't
If I were
really done
you,
that
I
well.
would.
For example,
if
you
you
can
are
see how the 2700X
to upgrade,
is
it's better to go for
14%
37X, man.
3900K.
Otherwise, you
However,
shouldn't
all
update.
that looks to have changed here with the
No,
third
it's
iteration
not.
of Ryzen, as we see the
No, because
3700X
that's,
easily
you
brushing
know,
aside the
successor to
9900K
your
by
CPU.
a 15% margin, basically matching the 10-core 7900X. Then we see the 3900X beating the 2920X by an 11% margin, and the
processor-
9900K by a
Pause,
whopping
pause.
45% margin.
Okay,
So,
3.
yeah,
pause, okay.
king of product.
713.
7:15. Okay, I was slightly late. Okay.
No, I'll put it 715. Give me a second.
Okay.
Oh, now I'm on 715.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm looking at the Intel processor. Yeah. What's he reviewing? He's reviewing the i9 9900X. Yeah. 450.
Intel, you mean?
Intel. Yeah.
i9 7900X.
7900.
You can see it. It's third from above.
Okay. So the 9900X. Yeah.
Yeah.
K. Sorry. 9900K is 450.
450. And this one,
Uh,
37X.
Earlier, I'm not sure. 39. That's 450 as well.
But how about the i9 7900X?
Okay, one sec. The 3700X is 320.
No.
No. I'm just telling you what the AMD one is. The Intel.
Yeah, Intel. How much does 7900X 7900X i9?
Okay, that's 370. So it's £50 cheaper, the 3700X.
Then 9700
Yes.
7900X.
Yes.
Okay. We
Ready?
continue. They're gonna he gonna show at the end,
Yeah,
price
let's
comparison.
go.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, go.
Activity, it looks like. I already said that, but damn, these productivity results are impressive.
Yep.
Then when it comes to decompression work, 3rd gen Ryzen still enjoys a handy performance advantage.
man.
Here the 3700X was 11%
Kills the
faster
Threadripper.
than the 9900K and a whopping 52% faster
52%.
than the 9700K.
Look how much faster it is than yours, man.
Meanwhile, the 3900X was a little over
Actually,
60%
not too
faster
much.
than the 9900K,
It is.
and even offered a
30,000 points
17% performance
actually,
uplift
okay.
over the Threadripper
Like
2920X.
14,000 points. That's
Now,
like
this
more than
result
10%.
really gets
okay,
me quite
Adobe.
excited
This
if
is
the
Adobe.
previous ones haven't already, as I use Premiere on an almost daily
lot of
basis,
people use it.
and I'm currently doing so with a Threadripper 2950X. Here we see the 3900X is 8% faster than the 2920X, so this means the 3950X will beat the 2950X quite comfortably when it's released in a few months' time. And with that, I can't even imagine what the 3rd gen Threadripper series will be able to deliver. Anyway, here the 3900X was 22% faster than the 9900K, and that's no small performance uplift. In fact, even the 3700X edged out the 9900K, making it 25% faster than the 9700K.
9700K
And then
so
what
much
makes these
25%
results
faster,
even more
cheaper.
impressive is the fact that Premiere is a very pro Intel piece of software, so that is to say it's quite biased towards Intel. AMD's shown the 3900X to be a little over 50% faster than the 9900K in DaVinci Resolve, and yeah, I know, I need to get a DaVinci project sorted out so I can start adding that to our benchmarks, and I promise I'll get that done soon. But anyway, the results in Premiere are still
ridiculous.
very, very impressive. Moving along, first up we have the older 1.0.8 version of the V-Ray benchmark, and I've included this because, well, I had all the data for the previous processors,
I don't care about
and I
this
thought,
stuff,
well,
but yeah.
might as well just add the 3rd gen processors and show you how they compare. Anyway, using this older version, the 3900X took just 48 seconds to complete the workload, while the 3700X took just 68 seconds.
Look at people who bought this
means although
i5
the 3600X was
7600K.
slightly slower
They're like fucking
than the
idiots, man.
9900K, it was much faster than the 9700K. Meanwhile, the 3900X beat
8700K
absolutely
looks
everything,
getting
including
battered,
the
man.
2920X.
You know, 8700K is probably the
We also
most
see
used
very
Intel
similar
processor.
margins in the newest version of the V-Ray benchmark, though here the Core i7-7900X does manage to edge ahead of the 2920X. Despite that though, the 3900X easily conquered all, while the 3700X
People who-
wasn't
for
much
people
slower
who
than
do
the
this a lot, you know,
9900K.
video editing, the
So, another
Overshot
strong
and this
result
V-Ray.
for AMD.
This is great, you know.
Similar margins are also seen when testing with Corona. The
No, when they get the
3900X was 30% faster than the
3950X.
9900K, while the 3700X was just 10% slower than the Core i9 processor.
It's
The
real workhorse,
3700X
you know.
was also 12% faster than the 2700X. Certainly not its most extreme performance uplift over the second gen
Okay.
Ryzen part, but certainly decent all the same.
Yeah, it's decent.
The last application we're going to look at is
Blender.
Blender, and once again we see
holy
similar
crap.
margins
That's
between the
pretty
tested
impressive. Look at
processors, though this time the
Look how
3700X
much,
is much
30%
closer
faster
to the
almost.
9900K than it is to the 2700X. While running the Blender Open Data benchmark, I also measured the entire system power draw, so let's check out those results before getting into
Power
the
draw.
gaming benchmarks. Well, would you look at that? The 3700X consumed less power than the 2600X. Quite a bit
Look at
less,
this shit,
and
man.
even less than the 8700K.
Look compared to yours, man.
In fact,
Your-
it was
yours is
comparable
drawing
to the
209.
R5 2600
And this
and
is
1600,
No, no. Yeah,
along
my
with
one,
the old
221,
quad-core 7700K. And just
Yeah,
as
yeah, 221.
remarkable was the 3900X, which was comparable
Almost
to the
like
2700X
geez, look at this.
and
That's actually
7900X,
pretty nice.
making it
impressive.
worlds more efficient than the 9900K and 2920X. It's pretty crazy when you realize that the 3900X was 41%
Intel is leading
faster
because they have only 4
than the
cores. That
9900K in
i5.
Blender,
Shit, man.
and yet it reduced total system consumption by 8%. That really is a stellar result for AMD, and on that high note, I'm going to cautiously move into the gaming benchmarks.
Okay, see.
Right, so starting with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the new 3rd gen Ryzen processors
That's
are
close
around
enough.
10% faster than the
Yeah,
2700X, which is
But
quite
is
a
he
good
taking
result,
into
really.
account
But
clock
it's
speed?
not good enough to beat the 9900K,
But what's the
at
clock
least
speeds?
when looking at the average
Base,
frame
base.
rate.
He didn't overclock
Despite
it. It's
similar
base.
frame time
Yeah, well,
performance,
base
the
for
9900K was
9900K is
4% faster
small,
on average at
but bursts in
1080p
at 5.1.
with an RTX 2080 Ti. I know this is really close enough to call a tie, so
Right, pause it.
let's see what happens at 1440p.
No, you don't have to pause it.
Oddly, we
Okay,
don't
do you
see a
pause
coming
it?
together
Yeah,
of the
pause it.
results at
3, 2,
1440p
1
like
now.
you would expect.
Okay.
What time? What time?
One sec. 12 to 16. Okay. All I'm saying is, he's comparing stock, right? Stock
Yeah.
stock 9900K, yeah, is okay. What's the stock 9900K? Stock 9900K is 3.6, yeah, turboed at 5 gigahertz, right?
Yeah. Yes.
The maximum turbo on the 3900 is 4.4 or 4.5.
Yeah, but
So-
who cares? He has to review it like that, man. He can't
Right.
review it
Well,
hertz by hertz, man.
Extrapolation. You can say, but this is painting a wrong
I
picture.
want to see what stock CPU does against stock CPU. I don't care about.
Right, but I'm sort of extrapolating.
I'm sure he'll put down the thing, but you know, the you know,
It's operating
comparison
600
by power.
megahertz, 600 more megahertz faster.
Yeah, I know, but this is not Intel's
that's
fault if they have,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, that's good.
I'm sure they're gonna perform per watt, you know,
Okay, go.
stuff. And 3, 2, 1, go.
Expect, but rather the 9900K is now 6% faster than the 3900X, and even more bizarre is the fact that the 2920X is now matching the 3900X. Though to be fair, it wasn't too far behind at 1080p, so perhaps all that extra memory bandwidth
Couple of frames.
is coming in handy at 1440p.
Two
Then we see
frames.
that the 9700K
On-
was
on
also
low.
6% faster than the 3700X. Again, not a big margin, but I was hoping to see less of a gap at 1440p.
He's talking nonsense again.
Right, so these results are a little bit disappointing. Well,
Why?
maybe that's a bit too harsh. After all, the 3rd gen Ryzen parts were both 11% faster than the 2700X, and that is another decent performance gain. The problem is, they're both well down on the 9900K's average and 1% low performance. The 9900K was 8% faster on average and 13% faster when looking at the 1% low result. Again,
this is
certainly not
Intel.
a massive margin, but given the
Benchmark.
slides that we'd seen from AMD, I have to admit I was hoping for more. Still, it is worth noting that at 1440p, the 9900K
Oh, look
was
at that
just 4%
1440p,
faster
4
than
frames,
the
man.
3900X, and generally
5
anything
frames,
within a 5%
nothing.
margin I declare as a draw. So at least under these more
You have to
typical
remember,
gaming
you should
conditions,
compare it
there's
to
almost
old
nothing
Ryzen,
in it.
man. You know,
But
also.
that
Yeah,
still
that's
doesn't
what I'm
change
looking.
the fact
Yeah,
that the
it's up.
9900K is
It's
the
basically the
superior
same.
gamer, or at least it is for today's games. Now, here's our biggest deficit yet. This time the 9900K was 17% faster than the 3900X when comparing the average frame rate, and 20% faster for the 1% low result. The 3700X did do better relative to the 9700K, but again, gaming
This was
still looks to be
always the
advantage
thing
Intel.
for Intel.
It's
Shadow.
higher
Bumping the
clock
resolution
speed.
up to 1440p does reduce the margins quite heavily, and now the
Yeah.
9900K was just 8% faster
clock
for the
speed.
average
It's all it
frame
is,
rate.
it's clock
Look
speed.
at
And this is certainly a
1440p.
more
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
realistic
10
resolution
at 1080
for
it's
an
clock
RTX
speed,
2080
yeah?
Ti.
Yeah, of course. More,
I
yeah,
have
it's
to
clock
admit, I
speed
was
more than
hoping
the
these third-gen
course.
Ryzen processors
Same
would
again.
be a
And
little
I guarantee
more
when it
punchy
gets
in
to
Division 2,
1440,
but don't get
then
me
it
wrong, the
becomes
gameplay was still incredibly
And you're
smooth.
gaming on
But even
2K,
so, the
so you couldn't
9900K
care
was
less
still
about
11% faster than the 13900X. But with similar 1% low performance, the Ryzen processors really were smooth operators. Then as we move
There
to
you go,
1440p, as you'd
Yeah,
probably
1440p,
expect
there
in
you
this game, we're now entirely GPU bound with these higher end CPUs, and this allowed the 9900K, 9700K, 3700X and 3900X to all deliver identical performance. Next up we have Far Cry New Dawn, and this title, along with previous installments in this series, have always been troublesome for AMD Ryzen processors. Here we see the 2700X allowing for just 98 FPS on average, and that made the 9900K 26% faster. The new 3rd gen Ryzen parts don't completely solve this issue, but they do dramatically push things in the right direction for AMD. And as a result, we see that the 9900K is now just 10% faster than both the 3900X and
That's good
3700X.
IPC improvement.
Then
And
at
this is
1440p,
before.
the margin
Look at
is
now.
reduced
Yeah, yeah.
even further,
And
as you'd
yeah,
probably
this is
expect.
also
And now it's
you
just
know,
the 1%
when they get the
low
drivers
results
sorted
that
out a bit
noticeably
more,
favour
you know, and the
Intel
games
8-core
take
processors.
account of it as well.
The deficit seen in Far Cry New Dawn
Same
was a
here.
little disappointing, and the same can be said when discussing the World War Z results. In fact, this is by far the most disappointing result we've seen, and that's because the 3rd gen Ryzen processors are no faster than the 2700X. This means the 9900K was 18% faster than the 3900X, and the 9700K was 21% faster than the 3700X. So whatever it is that past Ryzen processors don't like about World War Z, this latest generation isn't able to address. Even at the more GPU limited 1440p, the 9900K was still able to
It's
beat the
shitty, unoptimized
3900X
game,
by
that's why.
a 9% margin.
You know.
So again, not an ideal result for AMD. Moving on, we have some Rage 2 results, and here the 3900X and 3700X do perform very well, offering slightly
Okay.
better 1% low performance
That's
than the
just because-
2700X, which
Because
puts
the
them on par with
ID know how to program a
3700K.
game, do you know what I mean?
Having said all that though, we do see that the 9900K
Or how to
and
make an engine.
9700K
Let's see,
offer
you know,
slightly
Doom,
better 1% low
benchmark.
performance,
Yeah.
around 7% better. Not really a big deal here, and as you might expect, the gaming experience was virtually identical. Then at 1440p, we're entirely GPU bound with these higher end CPUs. From the 3700X up, we're able to get the most out of the RTX 2080 Ti. Hitman 2 is another one of those titles that's never been that friendly with AMD Ryzen processors, and we see that it's still an issue for the 3rd gen parts. Here the 9900K beat the 3900X by a 15% margin, though that's nothing like the 27% margin it beats the 2700X by, so there is that. Once again, the margins at 1440p are heavily reduced, and now the 9900K is just 5% faster than the 3900X. The 3700X was still 9% faster than the 2700X, so the 3rd gen Ryzen series have really made a good step forward here when it comes to gaming.
Yeah.
Finally, the last game that we're going to look at is Total War 3 Kingdoms, and this is a solid result for AMD. The 3700X was able to improve the 1% low performance of the 2700X by an 8% margin, making it just 1% slower than the 9900K and 5% slower than the 9700K, which
Basically
actually
the
does a
same.
little bit better in this title without hyperthreading. Then at 1440p, we're once again almost entirely GPU bound, leaving just a frame or two in it at the
This
most.
is what you want. You
So I
want
think
your
that's
games
a
to
pretty
be
good spot to
GPU
wrap
bound,
up the
not
game
CPU.
benchmarks.
You know.
And I think we'll move on to take a quick look at some memory scaling, or at least how DDR4
You don't buy
3200
280
and
Ti and have i3
compare.
processor, and that's just stupid.
DDR4
exactly.
3600 is the fastest memory spec AMD recommends using with 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs, as higher clocked memory will actually reduce performance, at least when clocked higher than 3733, as this changes the Infinity Fabric to a 2-to-1 mode rather than a 1-to-1 mode. Basically, 2-to-1 sees the Infinity Fabric clocked at a quarter of the memory speed, while 1-to-1 is half. Since AMD did recommend DDR4 3600 memory
Okay.
for optimal performance
So
and
overclocking
provided
memory
reviewers
doesn't
with a
pay
CL16 kit, I thought I'd better test it out, just to make sure we're not hampering performance by using the CL14 3200 kit. The good news is we're not. Here you'll see virtually identical performance in Corona, WinRAR, Far Cry New Dawn, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and World War Z. Unfortunately, due to time, I didn't get a whole lot of memory testing done, but this is something I will follow up with, providing a much more detailed video in the near future. At the request of many of our Patreon members, I also took a quick look at chipset performance, comparing B450 to X570 using the MSI
Yours
B450
is,
Tomahawk and X570
X4 or
creation.
X450.
I didn't include an
470.
X470 board, again due to time, and given we know
I see.
B450 and X470 boards deliver the same performance, you should be able to fill in the gaps pretty easily there. Looking at the Cinebench scores, there appears to be a slight performance advantage in favour of the X570 board,
much.
but we're only talking a 1%
X570 is the high end,
difference,
yeah?
which
Yeah,
is
that's
within
the
the
top
margin
board.
of error, though the
Yeah.
results did always favour the X570
And
board when
B450
taken
is
an
the
average
lowest
of
board.
3 runs.
Yeah. so might
Enabling
as well go
PBO
with B.
plus Auto OC
Okay,
in
got
the
more
Ryzen
features and
Master,
better
Yeah.
we again see similar performance on the X570 and B450 boards. And as claimed by AMD, the PBO feature of the 3rd gen Ryzen processors can be enabled on all motherboards that support these processors. And just lastly, a quick look at gaming performance with World War Z, and again, very similar performance on both boards.
No
I will have
difference.
a much more in-depth video soon looking at B350 and X370 motherboards, but given the time I had allocated for this review, we're going to have to settle with the B450 versus X570 comparison. Moving on, we have some IPC testing, and for
Cool,
this
there
I've
you go.
clocked the 9900K, 3700X, 2700X, and 1700X at 4GHz
IPC, this is
using the
important.
same DDR4 3200 CL14
This,
memory.
this shows you
The
the
results,
difference.
I have to
Yeah,
say, are
instruction
quite
per clock.
staggering. Whereas clock for clock, the 2700X is 4% slower than the 9900K. The 3700X
This is what you wanted.
is
Yes.
13%
Yes.
faster. I don't really know what to say about that. It's a pretty amazing result.
Clock
So
for clock.
I guess
Yes.
there you have
Yeah.
it. AMD certainly weren't stretching the truth when they claimed a 15% improvement in IPC over 2nd gen Ryzen. Here we're seeing an 18% improvement. Interestingly though, we do only see an 11% boost in single core performance, but
Yeah,
even
they're gonna
so,
lie a
that's still
little
a
bit, of
massive
course, you know, when they
generational
say
jump,
15, so-
and that means the 3700X was still 7% faster than the 9900K when matched clock for clock.
Close.
Despite the mind-blowing Cinebench results, the 9900K is still able to show these young, feisty Ryzen processors who's boss when it comes to gaming. Clock for clock, the 9900K was still 10% faster than the 3700X.
This is better.
However, perhaps more shocking is the fact that in this particular title, the 3700X was just 2% faster than the 2700X. I guess this explains why the results in this particular title and others such as Far Cry New Dawn
World War
were
Z and
a little
Far
more
Cry, they are-
disappointing than we were hoping for. Still, we do see quite a different story when testing with Battlefield 5, at least when comparing the 2nd and 3rd gen Ryzen processors.
It's closer.
Here the 3700X provided an 8% performance boost over the 2700X when both were locked at the same 4GHz frequency.
And it's 10.
Despite that though,
It's
the
10%,
9900K
yeah,
was
10%
still
better.
7% faster than the
Per clock.
3700X. So
Yeah.
why is that? Well, once again, a big part of the issue is core-to-core latency. But the good news is AMD's made massive strides forward in this area, taking core-to-core latency from around 81 nanoseconds down to just 56 nanoseconds, and that's a 30% reduction in latency. This also means core-to-core communication is just 11% slower when compared to the 9900K, and that's a big part of why we're seeing 3rd gen Ryzen close in on the 9900K's gaming performance, but also why it's still not quite there yet. Also, just lastly, something that seemed a bit odd at first when I discovered it is the memory write performance of 3rd gen Ryzen. It's significantly down on the 1st and 2nd gen parts. AMD's made a compromise here, as client workloads do very little writing, so rather than use this space to improve something that isn't really going to boost performance overall, they've invested this silicon real estate in more beneficial ways to achieve tangible performance gains. So whereas the core complex die to IO die link for reading memory is 32 bytes wide, it's only 16 bytes wide for writing, and this is why the peak write bandwidth is effectively cut in half.
Okay.
Now, time for the overclocking results, and again, due to limited time, I didn't do as much testing here as I would have liked, but it seems pretty clear that just like the 1st and 2nd gen Ryzen CPUs, there's very little overclocking headroom to speak of with these 3rd gen Ryzen processors. And this really isn't that surprising. Both AMD and Intel locked in a fierce battle which sees both trying to extract the maximum amount of performance they can from these high-end CPUs. At best, I was able to boost the 3900X's multi-core score by 4%, while the 3700X saw a 6% increase.
Why put more
However, as was the case with 2nd gen Ryzen, the simple
Navi reviews
multiplier
are up,
of
and then
the
after
method
this
that I
one we
used
watch
for the
Navi.
4.3 GHz all-core overclock is not really the method you want to be using. Here we see when looking at the single core results, it does reduce performance, leaving PBO overclocking as the most effective method overall. Still, I feel that most won't bother overclocking to extract that extra 4 to 6% performance, and from what I've heard from other reviewers, 4.3 GHz seems to be one of the better overclocks, at least for the 3900X. On an even more disappointing note, I somehow managed to end the life of my 3900X. There's really no delicate way to say it. At this stage of the review, yeah, I managed to kill my Ryzen 9 3900X processor. I'm not sure exactly what settings were applied. I know I hadn't got into manually adjusting the voltage yet. I was letting the board handle it. I'm not going to specify which board it was because these were very early BIOSes that, yeah, well, they were review BIOSes that hadn't been fully validated. Anyway, I believe I was, well, after testing 4.3 GHz, I decided to, again, leave the voltage on auto and then increase the LLC to see if I could, see what impact that had on temperatures and stuff like that. I was just messing around. It was very, very late at night. I wasn't fully paying attention to what I was doing, but I certainly never expected to kill the processor. In all my years, never ever run into a problem like this. Anyway, booted up into Windows. I wasn't really voltage monitoring, so maybe my bad. Anyway, I only ran a Cinebench 20 pass, a multi-core pass, which doesn't run for particularly long time. Anyway, it crashed about halfway through, reset the system, and sadly, it never booted up again. The CPU now gets stuck at code 07, which is AP initialization after microcode. I tried another completely different X570 board from a different brand, so yeah, completely different board, and I got the exact same postcode error. Then after trying the B450 Tomahawk, once that was flashed up and working with the 3700X, I tried the 3900X, and yeah, sadly, it was declared completely dead at that point. Did not boot up at all. AMD assures me that no other reviewers have managed to kill their 3900X, so I guess I'm just special or unlucky. I'll let you guys pick on that one. Special. AMD has sent me a replacement, but unfortunately it hasn't arrived in time for me to update any of the testing that I didn't get done, obviously, in this review. That'll be arriving, well, tomorrow, so Monday, and then I can get on with a few more tests I want to do, like try the 3900X on B450 motherboards, add it to our IPC testing so we can see how 2 chiplets impact the results there. But anyway, that's what happened. So extremely unfortunate. In all my years, never ever had this problem. But obviously, CPUs do have a defective rate, as small as it is. So maybe it wasn't anything to do with the early BIOSes. It was just a bad chip. Unfortunately, the death of my 3900X also means I don't have any temperature data at all. So for this, we're just going to have to settle for what I've been able to collect with the 3700X. Basically, with the Wraith Prism RGB box cooler, you can get pretty close to extracting maximum performance out of the 3700X. Though it does get a little toasty, but on the bright side, the cooler is very quiet. So 87 degrees for overclock is very respectable.
Not much different.
Of course, if you are going to overclock, I recommend an aftermarket cooler. You certainly don't need something as expensive as the Corsair Hydro Series H115i, but
you can do with stock if you don't know testing.
No, I'll always.
And as you
always.
can see, after an hour,
I like to
on Blender stress
flatline it. I
test,
don't
the
like there being any
3700X
boosts. I
peaked
like
at
to
just
flatline
73
the
degrees.
CPU.
It's a shame I don't have
Like
the
now, I've got it
3900X
set at
results, but
4.2
I
no
suspect
matter
with
what.
the box cooler, it runs at around 80 degrees stock under heavy load. Of course, all the results for the 3900X seen in this video were recorded with the box cooler, as I noted earlier. Okay, so we've now seen how these new 3rd gen Ryzen processors perform. It's time to work out if you should actually buy them and what do they offer in terms of value. So
Yeah,
let's move on to do that. Looking at the current asking prices, you're paying quite a premium for these new CPUs when compared to the 2nd gen parts, but that's really hardly surprising. When compared to the Intel competition, purely for gaming, the 3700X is on par with the 9700K and 8700K in terms of value. The 3900X doesn't stack
Yeah,
up
it's too
quite
much.
as well
That's what
here,
I was saying.
and this means the 9900K is
37X
actually
is
quite a
sweet
bit
spot.
better in terms of value.
Yep.
Or is it? While the 3900X comes with a box cooler, none of the Intel K-SKU
it's
parts
true.
do.
That's true.
So let's add in the cost of a good air
Exactly.
cooler and then recalculate the cost per frame.
Yep.
When I asked on Twitter, most of you seemed to agree that the Be Quiet Dark Rock 4 for $75 was a reasonable pairing
It's
for the
reasonable.
9900K and
75
9700K.
pounds, yeah.
So I've added that to the budget for the K processors.
They're almost the same.
Factoring in the cooler means the 3900X is now better value than the 9900K, and the 3700X is very similar to the Core i5 9600K.
Okay, there you go.
Motherboard costs are much the same really, so it's just the cooler that those considering Intel need to account for. As for AMD's 2nd and 1st gen Ryzen processors, well, they're bloody cheap these days, so it makes it hard to compare them
my
with
CPU's
these
gone down by
new
what,
3rd gen
80
Ryzen
pounds
parts.
since it launched.
Still, the 3700X costs just
That's why it's a
14%
good
more
value.
per frame than the 2700X, and given the massive power savings and improvement in single and lightly threaded workloads, I think it's well worth that premium. So it'll be interesting to see how the Ryzen
he's
5
actually recommending you
3600
to buy it.
stacks up against the R5 2600
Yeah,
and
I'm gonna buy it.
1600
Yeah, that's what he
when
basically
I
said, you
test it
know.
in a few days' time.
But
Moving on from gaming, let's take a quick